My name is Emily Carter, and I'm 29 years old. If you had told me a few years ago that one day I'd be leading a multi-million-dollar investment deal in the same room where my family once laughed at me for daring to dream, I wouldn't have believed you. I come from a family where confidence was currency, and I was always bankrupt. The men in my family ran conversations like board meetings, loud and absolute. Women were expected to nod, smile, and make sure the food never ran out. At family gatherings, they always gave me the smallest seat at the table, the one at the corner that barely fit between the wall and the edge. It became symbolic in a way, a reminder that in their eyes, I didn't belong among the decision-makers. They said I was too emotional, too unsure, too soft to ever handle business. My father used to joke that I'd be better off marrying someone successful instead of trying to become someone successful. My brothers would laugh, and I'd smile like it didn't cut me. But inside, it did. Every joke, every condescending glance was a small humiliation that piled up until I stopped talking about my ambitions altogether. I had studied finance because I wanted to build something of my own, but every time I mentioned work, my family changed the subject. My brother Adam ran the family construction business and made sure everyone knew he was the future of the Carters. My father worshipped him for it. When I landed an entry-level job at a small investment firm, they called it a hobby. My mother said, "At least you'll learn something useful before you start a family." I never corrected them. I just kept showing up to work every day, taking notes, learning, staying late, listening more than I spoke. For years, I was the invisible one in that office too. The assistant who took minutes, who fetched coffee, who smiled while men twice my age took credit for ideas they dismissed when I first mentioned them. But I didn't complain. I understood something they didn't: silence doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes, it's strategy. Every time they ignored me, I learned more about how they worked, how deals were built, how people's egos ran the room. I studied people as much as I studied finance. At home, things didn't change. My father bragged about Adam's deals, his cars, his house, while I was the afterthought. During one dinner, my father looked at me and said, "You should be proud of your brother, Emily. Maybe one day you'll find something you're good at too." I smiled and nodded. I didn't argue. But that night, when everyone had gone to bed, I pulled out my laptop and started building a proposal for a project I'd been quietly researching, a new investment structure for mid-sized tech startups. I spent nights on that plan, running models, correcting errors, reading case studies until sunrise. I didn't have anyone cheering me on, so I became my own audience. Years passed, and I climbed slowly. The firm I worked for started trusting me with smaller deals. I treated each one like it was life or death. When my boss saw my precision, he began including me in meetings I once took notes for. I sat in rooms where money was moved like chess pieces and listened to how power disguised itself as politeness. When a senior partner suddenly resigned, I was asked to temporarily manage one of his portfolios. That was my opening. I didn't sleep for weeks, managing clients, balancing numbers, anticipating moves before anyone else. When the portfolio grew beyond expectations, the board noticed. My name started to appear in rooms I hadn't even entered yet. Then came the moment that changed everything. The firm was considering a partnership with an international group, an investment deal worth over $50 million. The partners were cautious, uncertain. I'd been studying this group for months, quietly building a risk management model that could make the deal safer. I presented it one evening, not expecting much. But when I finished, the room went silent. My boss looked at me and said, "Emily, are you saying this model could increase our returns by 15% with less risk?" I nodded. He smiled and said, "Prepare to lead the pitch." I almost couldn't breathe. The night before the presentation, I barely slept. I thought of every time I'd been told to stay quiet, every time someone handed me a smaller seat. That next morning, when I stood before the investors, I wasn't the shy assistant anymore. I spoke with calm precision, showing data, explaining strategy, answering every question with confidence I didn't even know I had. When it was over, the head of the investment group extended his hand and said, "We'd like you to lead this deal." My firm erupted in applause, and for the first time, I didn't shrink back, I met every gaze head-on. The news spread fast. I was promoted to senior partner within months. My salary multiplied, my name began appearing in financial publications, and suddenly the same people who once ignored me started calling me the future of the firm. But the real moment came at home. My father invited me to a family dinner, a rare thing. When I arrived, they were all there, Adam, his wife, my parents, even my uncle, who loved reminding everyone that women shouldn't handle money. The table looked the same, long and polished, with my usual seat waiting at the corner. But this time, I didn't take it. I walked to the head of the table and placed my folder down beside my father. He looked confused. I smiled and said, "Before we eat, I have an announcement." I told them about the deal, about how the firm had asked me to lead it, about the promotion. The room went quiet. Adam's smirk faded, my mother's fork froze midair, and my father's face turned pale. He cleared his throat and said, "You're leading it. You mean you helped?" I met his eyes and said, "No, Dad. I'm leading it." There was a long silence before he finally said, "I didn't realize you'd gone that far." His voice cracked a little. For once, I didn't need his approval. I just smiled and said, "Neither did anyone else." That dinner was different. My brothers didn't joke. No one tried to interrupt me. When my father poured the wine, his hands trembled slightly. For years, I'd sat quietly in that corner seat, waiting for respect. That night, respect didn't need to be offered, it was already mine. The next morning, my father called me. He said, "Emily, I watched your interview on TV. I'm proud of you." Those words didn't feel as sweet as I thought they would. I thanked him, but deep down, I realized I had already made peace long before he said them. I didn't work all those years for his pride. I did it for the girl who once sat at the edge of the table, pretending to be invisible while dreaming of more. Months later, when the deal closed successfully, the firm held a ceremony to celebrate. Reporters, clients, executives, everyone was there. The head of the investment group stood beside me, shaking my hand in front of flashing cameras. He said, "Emily Carter led one of the smoothest negotiations we've ever seen." In that moment, my mind drifted to every dinner, every small seat, every word that tried to keep me small. I wished they could see me there, not out of revenge, but as proof. Proof that silence can turn into strength, that the smallest seat doesn't define your future, and that sometimes, the person no one takes seriously ends up leading the entire room. When I got home that night, I took off my heels, sat on my couch, and let the exhaustion wash over me. The city lights flickered through my window, and I thought about how far I had come from that scared girl hiding behind her father's voice. The truth is, revenge doesn't always come with shouting or payback. Sometimes it's quiet, elegant, and complete. It's walking into the same kind of room that once dismissed you and hearing someone say, "We want you to lead." I didn't need to make them feel small anymore. I had outgrown the need. My story wasn't about proving them wrong, it was about proving myself right. And maybe that's what real revenge looks like. Not anger, not pride, but peace, the kind that comes from knowing you never needed a bigger seat at the table. You just needed to build your own. I was the one who didn't quite fit in. In my family, confidence was everything, and volume meant victory. My father and brothers filled every room with their voices, their opinions, their certainty. I learned early that the best way to survive in that house was to stay quiet. Every family dinner felt like a meeting I wasn't invited to, and yet I was always there, sitting at the edge, pretending not to notice that my chair was smaller, squeezed into the corner of the table. It became my place, the one nobody else wanted, the one that reminded me I was only there because they allowed it. My father used to say it was good for me to learn humility. I think what he really meant was that I needed to learn my place. I was never loud or confrontational. I didn't know how to argue the way they did, shouting over each other until someone gave up. I just listened. I listened when they joked about how women shouldn't worry about business. I listened when my father told my brothers they'd inherit the company one day, and then turned to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You'll make a wonderful wife to someone successful," he'd say. My brothers would laugh, and my mother would stay quiet, pretending she hadn't heard. Every time it happened, I'd feel my throat tighten, but I'd just nod and smile, because arguing never changed anything in that house. When I told them I wanted to study finance, the room went silent. Then my father laughed, like I had told the funniest joke in the world. "Finance," he said. "Sweetheart, that's not for you. That's a man's game. You should pick something easier, something that suits you." I didn't argue. I just walked to my room, closed the door, and cried quietly where no one could see me. That night, I made a promise to myself. If they were going to give me the smallest seat at their table, I would find my own table one day, and I would make sure it was one they'd never get invited to. They never took me seriously after that. When I got into university, no one congratulated me. My father said, "That's nice," like I'd told him I was going on vacation. My brothers joked that I'd probably drop out before the first semester ended. I laughed along, pretending their words didn't hurt, but inside, something hardened. I realized they'd already decided who I was allowed to be. They saw me as delicate, uncertain, too quiet to lead, too emotional to handle pressure. They didn't see the hours I spent studying late at night, or how I stayed awake until sunrise memorizing formulas and case studies. They didn't see that every insult, every smirk, every dismissal was carving strength into me. At family dinners, I kept taking that small seat, smiling as they talked about business deals and money. My father would sometimes look at me and say, "You're lucky to have smart men around you. You'll never have to worry about this complicated stuff." I'd just nod, and in my mind, I'd whisper, "I'm not lucky. I'm learning, because that's what I did, I learned." I studied them. The way they talked, the way they negotiated, the way they bragged about things they barely understood. I didn't have a voice at that table yet, but I was listening, storing everything. I wasn't invisible. I was preparing. Years later, when I walked into my first finance office, I still remembered that small seat, that corner of the table where no one listened to me. It didn't make me bitter, it made me careful. I learned to observe before speaking, to build my confidence quietly. I didn't need to shout to be heard. I just needed to wait until the right moment to speak, and when that moment finally came, they wouldn't be able to ignore me. When I started working at the investment firm, it felt like my family all over again, rooms full of people who looked right through me. I was the assistant who took notes, fetched coffee, and stayed behind to clean up after meetings. Nobody remembered my name during introductions, and when they did, they pronounced it wrong. Every idea I brought up was brushed aside until someone else repeated it louder. I wanted to speak up, but I had learned something from years of sitting at that small table at home: sometimes silence can be your armor. I decided to watch, to listen, to study. If they weren't going to give me space, I would learn how to take it when the time was right. The office was cold in more ways than one. The partners moved through the halls with confidence that came from knowing they belonged. They didn't need to prove anything, they were already part of the circle. I was the outsider, the one who smiled too politely and worked too hard. Every morning, I'd arrive before everyone else, straighten the conference room, and sit with my coffee, reading financial reports while the city outside was still waking up. I'd listen to their conversations when they thought I wasn't paying attention, noting how they spoke to clients, how they handled risk, how they disguised insecurity with charm. They thought I was just another quiet girl doing clerical work, but I was building something invisible: knowledge, awareness, leverage. When the day ended, most people left early for dinners or parties. I stayed. I stayed because I didn't have a name to protect yet, no reputation to lose. The office lights buzzed overhead as I read through deal memos, case studies, and contracts that no one expected me to understand. I took notes, highlighted trends, learned the language of power, the tone, the patience, the precision. Every time someone ignored me, I learned how to listen sharper. Every time they laughed, I memorized what they found funny. It wasn't about blending in, it was about learning how to navigate their world better than they did. There were moments that stung more than I'd like to admit. When I brought an analysis to a partner once, he barely looked up from his screen before saying, "That's cute, but leave the real work to us." I smiled, said nothing, and went back to my desk. The next week, he used my exact analysis in a meeting and took credit for it. I didn't confront him. I just made a quiet promise that next time, I'd make sure no one could take what was mine. At home, things weren't much different. My father kept praising my brother's latest deal, calling him a natural businessman. When he turned to me, he'd say, "How's your little job going?" I'd answer politely, "It's going well," even when I was exhausted to the bone. I didn't try to explain the long nights or the pressure. They wouldn't have understood. I let them think I was small, because that's what made my growth invisible. Some nights, when I walked home past tall office buildings lit up like constellations, I'd imagine myself in one of those corner offices, speaking confidently, being heard. I'd whisper to myself, "They don't see you yet, but they will." That thought carried me through every insult, every dismissal, every quiet humiliation. The truth was, I didn't need them to believe in me. I was learning how to believe in myself so completely that one day, no one else's opinion would matter. Every small task, every ignored comment, every overlooked contribution, it was all part of my training. They thought they were keeping me in the background. What they didn't realize was that I was learning how to run the whole room from the shadows. There was a time when everyone around me was moving fast, climbing ladders, celebrating promotions, and I was just working quietly, unnoticed. I had no one cheering for me, no one telling me I was capable of more. My family thought my job was just a temporary distraction before I settled down, and at the firm, I was still seen as the assistant who blended into the background. But while they were busy overlooking me, I was building something they couldn't see. Every night after work, I'd stay behind, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I'd open spreadsheets, read financial journals, analyze case studies, and practice pitch models like they were puzzles I needed to solve. My world was small, but my dreams weren't. I remember one night in particular. The office was empty, the city lights glowing through the glass windows, and I sat there staring at my computer screen, exhausted but determined. I was working on a project no one had asked for, a new financial model I believed could help the firm attract mid-sized tech startups. It wasn't part of my job description, and I knew no one would listen if I pitched it yet, but I couldn't shake the thought that it could work. I told myself that even if no one noticed now, one day they would. So I kept going, one equation at a time, one late night after another. My family still didn't take me seriously. My father would call to talk about my brother's achievements, his new clients, his expanding business, and then casually ask, "So how's that little office job of yours?" I'd smile into the phone and say, "It's going fine," even when it wasn't. I stopped expecting approval from them, it only made me stronger. When they laughed, I worked harder. When they dismissed me, I added another hour to my study time. I turned every doubt into a small piece of fuel. The firm didn't notice my effort right away. I was still fetching coffee during meetings, still taking minutes for executives who never remembered my name. But small things started to change. When they talked numbers, I began to understand every detail. When they debated strategy, I could predict what each person would say before they said it. I was learning the rhythm of power, the way people spoke when they felt untouchable. I didn't speak up yet, I wasn't ready, but inside, I was preparing. After months of staying invisible, I got my first real opportunity. One of the senior analysts called in sick right before a presentation. My manager looked around the room and asked who could cover for him. No one volunteered. Then he looked at me, half jokingly, and said, "You think you can handle it?" I nodded, even though my heart was racing. I stayed up the entire night preparing. I knew the data better than anyone, and when the time came, I walked into that room and spoke with a confidence I didn't even know I had. When I finished, the silence was different this time. It wasn't dismissal, it was surprise. They clapped, a few even smiled, and my manager said, "Well, looks like we underestimated you." That moment didn't change everything overnight, but it cracked something open. It was the first time I saw respect in their eyes. I went home that evening and sat in silence, not to celebrate, but to process what had happened. I realized that waiting for someone to notice me had been a mistake. I wasn't meant to be discovered. I was meant to build myself quietly, piece by piece, until my work spoke louder than my voice ever could. From that day forward, I stopped trying to prove myself to anyone. I just worked. Because I knew one thing for sure, success built in silence has a way of speaking for itself when the time is right. The turning point came when one of the senior partners suddenly resigned. It happened out of nowhere, and everyone in the firm was scrambling to manage his clients and projects. I had been quietly helping with his accounts for months, handling the small details that no one else cared to pay attention to. When he left, I stepped in naturally, not because anyone asked me to, but because I already knew how everything worked. For weeks, I managed his portfolio behind the scenes, staying up late, checking numbers, sending reports that looked like they came from a full team. No one even realized it was me doing all the work until the results started showing. The portfolio began performing better than it had in months, clients were happier, and suddenly my name started coming up in meetings I wasn't even part of. The partners called me in one day, asking how I had managed to stabilize such a high-risk account. I explained it calmly, trying not to sound nervous, but inside I could feel my heart pounding. When I finished, one of them leaned back in his chair and said, "You've been sitting here all this time, and we didn't notice." I smiled and said, "I've been here all along, just doing the work." That was the first time I saw a spark of respect in their eyes, the kind I had been waiting for. From then on, things started to move quickly. They began assigning me to more meetings, giving me room to contribute ideas. I wasn't fetching coffee anymore, I was presenting numbers, defending strategies, and leading smaller client discussions. Every time they gave me something new, I made sure I exceeded expectations. I wasn't loud about it, I didn't need to be. I had learned long ago that quiet consistency could be more powerful than showy confidence. Then came the biggest opportunity of all. The firm was in talks with a global investment group about a potential partnership worth over $50 million. It was a deal that could define the next decade for the company, but it was also risky, and no one wanted to lead it. The senior partners were hesitant. I had been studying this particular group for months, analyzing their patterns, understanding their methods. Late one night, while reviewing the data, I built a new risk model that I believed could protect our side of the deal while increasing our returns. The next morning, I showed it to my manager. He read through it silently, then called the board into the room. For a moment, I thought I was in trouble, but instead, they asked me to explain it again. When I finished, one of the partners said, "This changes everything." A week later, I was asked to lead the presentation for the investment group. Me, the same person who had once been invisible in this office. I stayed up for 3 nights preparing every detail, running through my slides, practicing my tone, predicting every question they could ask. When the day finally came, I walked into that boardroom in a black suit, hands steady, voice calm. The investors listened carefully, and when I finished, the room went completely silent. Then their lead negotiator stood up, smiled, and said, "We'd like you to lead this deal." For a second, I couldn't breathe. My manager clapped, the partners nodded, and I knew in that moment everything had changed. That single meeting redefined me in their eyes. I wasn't the assistant anymore, I was the strategist who had saved a deal no one else dared to touch. It was strange, how quickly the same people who once ignored you could start to treat you like you were indispensable. But I didn't let it get to my head. I just went back to work, quietly, steadily, knowing that I had finally stepped out of the shadows for good. The morning after that presentation, I woke up to an inbox full of congratulations. The deal had been approved, and the firm wanted me to lead it from start to finish. I stared at the emails for a long time, my heart racing as the realization sank in. The same people who once forgot my name now wanted me to represent them. It felt surreal. The board announced it publicly that afternoon, and suddenly everyone who used to walk past my desk without a glance was stopping by to shake my hand. I smiled politely, thanked them, but inside, I felt something deeper than pride. It was validation, but not the kind that needed applause. It was the quiet kind, the one that tells you you were right to trust yourself even when no one else did. That night, I went home, poured myself a cup of tea, and sat by the window watching the city lights flicker. I thought about all those nights I stayed in that office alone, all the times I bit my tongue in meetings, all the moments I wanted to give up but didn't. Every piece of doubt, every moment of invisibility had led me here. I whispered to myself, "You did it," but it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The deal took months to close. It was the hardest project I'd ever handled, full of negotiations, last-minute changes, and endless pressure. There were times when I thought I'd crumble under it, but each challenge made me stronger. The investors respected me. They listened when I spoke. They asked for my opinion, not my notes. Every time I walked into those meetings, I carried a piece of my old self with me, the quiet girl who had been told to stay small. She was still there, but now she was sitting at the head of the table. When the deal finally closed, it made headlines. The firm held a small ceremony to celebrate, and the dean of our partner company personally thanked me for leading it with precision and grace. Cameras flashed, people clapped, but my mind wasn't in that room. It was back in my father's dining room, at that small chair in the corner. I could almost hear the laughter, the dismissive jokes, the reminders that I didn't belong in business. And now, here I was, proving that I always did. A few days later, my father invited me to a family dinner. I hadn't seen everyone together in months. When I walked in, the table was already set. The same long polished surface, the same smell of roasted food, and that same small chair waiting for me at the corner. But this time, I didn't sit there. I walked to the middle, pulled out a seat right beside my father, and smiled. He looked at me, confused. "Sit there," he said, pointing to the corner. I shook my head gently and replied, "Not tonight." Throughout dinner, they asked about the deal, about the firm, about the news. My brothers were quiet, their usual jokes gone. My father kept staring at me, pride and discomfort mixed in his eyes. When dessert came, he cleared his throat and said, "I saw the article about you. You did well. I didn't know you had it in you." I smiled softly and said, "Neither did you." The table went silent. It wasn't revenge, it was truth. For years, I had waited for that moment, and now that it was here, I didn't need to raise my voice. The silence itself was victory. Later that night, when I got home, I looked at the reflection in my window and realized something important. Success hadn't changed who I was, it had revealed who I'd been all along. I didn't need their validation anymore, not because I stopped caring, but because I finally understood that believing in myself was enough. Real power doesn't come from taking someone else's seat, it comes from knowing that even if the table disappears, you can build your own.